Jaylen Brown signed the richest deal in NBA history. What happened to our beautiful game? That was one of the most popular tweets published after Jaylen Brown signed the largest contract extension in NBA history, worth up to $304 million. To put that in perspective, Michael Jordan earned $94 million, not just in one contract, but for all the contracts in his entire career. Now I know that inflation exists and Michael Jordan got paid far more than his peers, but we're talking about Jaylen Brown here. The man who, according to Twitter, has no left hand and does this every single time he drives to the basket. But what if I told you that the Celtics really had no choice but to offer Jaylen Brown the largest extension in NBA history, and that Brown was actually in a way holding the team hostage, which allowed him to get this massive deal. And on top of that, this contract could end up forcing the Celtics to dismantle their roster in the next couple of seasons and destroy their current core. Let me start by saying, no, this Jaylen Brown contract is not the worst of all time, and it's not even close. We've seen guys like John Wall and Ben Simmons make over $40 million in a year without even touching the court. And let's not forget about Luol Deng, who the Lakers had to pay up until last season, even though he hasn't been on the team since 2017. It's safe to say that there's been a fair share of bad contracts in the NBA, but the concern regarding Jaylen Brown's massive new deal is honestly pretty valid. Yes, the Celtics are a fantastic young team that has seen a lot of good success in the postseason over the past few years. Yes, the duo of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum is one of the best in the NBA. And yes, this team is capable of winning a championship, as we've seen them make it to the finals or close to the finals consistently in the past few years. However, Jaylen Brown as a player has some flaws that, to say the least, are pretty concerning. At times, to put it simply, this man is a turnover machine, and last year he had one of the highest turnover per game averages in the entire NBA, with similar amounts to guys like Jordan Poole, James Harden, and Damian Lillard. But here's the part that's really concerning. All of the guys that I mentioned are primary ball handlers and or playmakers for this team. Well, aside for Poole, who just has that low IQ. But to be honest, Brown wasn't really the primary ball handler or playmaker for the team last year. This is a team that has a ton of guys who like to have the ball in their hands, whether it was Marcus Smart, Malcolm Brogdon, Jayson Tatum, or anyone else in that guard forward rotation. And to be honest, most of these turnovers probably come from the fact that Jaylen Brown has no left hand. Brown has notoriously got ripped on for his weak left hand off the dribble, which ultimately causes a ton of turnovers. But okay, we get it. Brown has flaws like any other player we've ever seen in the league. So how did this two-time All-Star get the biggest contract extension in NBA history? Well, even though Jaylen doesn't make the best decisions on the court at times, his off-the-court decisions are really what allowed him to secure this once-in-a-lifetime deal. In 2019, Jaylen Brown and the Boston Celtics agreed to a 4-year, $115 million contract extension. And before we dive into what Brown did in this situation, we have to keep in mind, this entire contract was a massive gamble for the Celtics. Brown had yet to show what he was truly capable of before signing this huge deal, given that he averaged just 13 points per game in the season prior. However, Brown did show enough promise to where the Celtics were comfortable making this extension. So he inked a very solid deal for a player of his caliber, but it was still 12% below the max contract level. But what if I told you that this was on purpose? Yes, Jaylen Brown could have easily demanded a larger 3 or even 4-year contract, but taking a pay cut over these past 4 years has positioned him to get the maximum value possible out of his new contract, which ultimately ends with him getting more money in his pocket than if he would have taken a bigger deal earlier in his career. And honestly, this makes sense, because if Jaylen would have taken that 3-year deal that made him a little more money, it would have put him in the same free agency class as guys like Bradley Beal, Kyrie Irving, Jalen Brunson, Zach LaVine, and James Harden, who are all obviously guards. Although in hindsight, all of these guys stayed with their teams except for Jalen Brunson, Brown and his team at the time obviously didn't know that. So they strategically decided on making Jaylen Brown a free agent in 2023, which gave him a lot more of the thing you need as a free agent when you're going in the market: leverage. With teams like the Houston Rockets willing to dish out big contracts as we saw with their signings of Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks, rumors began to fly that Jaylen Brown could leave the Celtics and join the Rockets with someone like James Harden, or even another star. And although this didn't happen, and the Celtics were able to pay Jaylen Brown $100 million more than any other team, it was enough to get this franchise to lock in this new deal without any hesitation, for the most part. Brown was able to leverage desperate teams to make the Celtics realize how valuable he was, which was a great play to ensure he got the most money possible. But let's be honest here, even though Jaylen Brown played his cards perfectly, the Celtics really had no choice but to bring him back. The team was in no position to let their second best option walk in free agency for nothing, and there wasn't a trade that fit their timeline and also got them equal value, or even any value for that matter. They couldn't have traded for Bradley Beal because of his no trade clause and him wanting to go to the Suns. Not that the team would have wanted him for Brown anyways. And young players who were in the rumors like Zion Williamson or Mikal Bridges ended up staying with their teams. Sure, they could have tested Jaylen Brown and let him play out the last year of his contract and try and find a trade during the season or lock him in at the end of the year, but that's just too risky of a move for the Celtics to pull off, especially for a player that's the caliber of Jaylen Brown, because he could just walk for nothing and the Celtics would be left scrambling to replace him. The deal is done though, and even though Celtics Twitter continues to go crazy, there's nothing that can be done at this point. But this brings us to the big question: what does this team's future look like after signing this massive deal? Not to be dramatic, but there's a very good chance that this deal alters the Celtics' path to a championship and ultimately causes them to lose either Jayson Tatum or Jaylen Brown. The odds of Tatum and Brown staying together for his whole contract really depends on one thing: winning. If the team is able to win a title next season or even the year after, it's obviously a no-brainer to keep this duo together. And with the addition of Kristaps Porzingis, the Celtics are now the betting favorites to win the title next year. So it's safe to say they're in a pretty good spot moving forward. But even if the team does win a championship next year, they still have a massive problem that could end up splitting up their duo. That being the collective bargaining agreement. Under these rules, starting in the 2024-25 season, teams like the Celtics who are over the second apron, which is basically just teams paying too much in the eyes of the NBA, don't have access to their mid-level exception and ability to sign players in the buyout market, along with a ton of other restrictions. The luxury tax penalties will also be even higher than before, making it way too expensive for most teams to keep their contending rosters. So basically, if the current Celtics team doesn't have what it takes to get a championship, the team would have to get off of Brown or Tatum's salary to get rid of the massive restrictions on the team, or the franchise would be forced to dismantle their core of elite role players like Rob Williams, Malcolm Brogdon, Derek White, and all those guys, which would just barely squeeze them under the second apron. Either way, the Celtics will have to dismantle their roster at some point, because plain and simple, the team just can't afford to keep all the players they have right now for the next 4 years. And like it or not, Jaylen Brown's massive extension will likely end in him getting traded, being that he could make nearly $70 million in the last year of his deal. And the worst part is, it's not even like the Celtics made a big mistake. Given their circumstances, this was the best thing they could have done for their franchise, but sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and make huge deals like this one. But there's actually another team that is in a great position moving forward. The Utah Jazz have just pulled off the fastest rebuild of all time, and it could see them landing a huge star. Click here to watch that video and see how the Jazz could pull off the unthinkable and trade for Joel Embiid.